Well, new plans that will reduce the number of small parties in council and force parties to sign binding coalition agreements and change the rules for no confidence motions have now been gazetted in Parliament. Under the proposed bill, a party would have to win more than 1% of the votes in a council to be represented. In other words, in Joburg right now, for example, 10 of the parties would no longer have councillors, including El Jamar. The mayor, Kabelo Gwamanda, comes from that party. Dr. Thina is a local governance expert and research associate at the University of Johannesburg. Dr. Nzo, good afternoon to you. We've seen quite a lot of discussion about these plans. Now we see it in a bill. It's being gazetted. Firstly, is the idea of setting a threshold of 1% of the vote to enter a council, is it a good idea?
Good afternoon, Stephen, and also good afternoon to your viewers. This is a topic that has been debated for quite some time, which actually talks about the proportional representational system that we have in this country, with retrospect with the ward councillors who also get into council. So the threshold is very interesting in the sense that if you look at it from a 1% perspective, it means that smaller parties, for example, like what you're saying, El Jamar, who had 2 seats in council, will automatically be excluded when it comes to the way in which they will allocate seats according to the number of votes that they will be counting using the formula that has been set out for local government. While on the other end, while one can argue that from a proportional representation, perspective, that might be very much unjust. But if we have looked at the dynamics that have been unfolding, particularly where smaller parties play a kingmaker role in determining which side, the allocation of, very lucrative positions in the executive or mayoral committee comes to play, they become the deciding factor. And to a large extent, we've seen these parties actually occupying some of the most lucrative seats in the mayoral committee, of which a lot of, citizens have been questioning the way in which these smaller parties have, the dominant effect in the final decision-making in the allocation of these positions.
Dr. Nzo, isn't there also a difference in terms of how you are elected to a council? So usually half of the councillors are a proportional representation, half of them are supposed to represent a ward. Now, for example, the idea, if I remember it correctly, was that while most of the people who represent wards do come from political parties, in some cases, a local community may, for whatever specific local issue, want to actually elect a person from that community to represent them. So in other words, they won't come from a party, they will be an independent candidate. Now, surely it would be wrong to stop communities from doing that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it will become a detrimental effect, under the notion of representational democracy, because it means that now you are really reducing the numbers of representatives who might be coming either through proportional representation or directly from the ward. And if you set this 1% threshold, where most probably in one ward you would find that the number of votes are actually predominantly, supporting this individual, candidate, and yet they don't meet that threshold, it can be very much unjust. Like what I said, that it can serve as as a notion of unjustness in the representational democracy system. But again, I think it comes predominantly from the fact that, the smaller parties in councils have been the ones who have become the kingmakers and also determining and making demands in terms of which positions that they would like to occupy. And yet when you look at, proportionally the amount of seats they occupy in council, where do they get, the majority electoral mandate to make these demands? So it's quite a very tricky one if you look at it from a representational democracy perspective and also the justness of it.
The idea of a binding public coalition agreement. So as I understand it, you would not be able to form a coalition, you would not be able to, I don't know how it would be managed, but you would basically force parties to say in public, we're working together as a coalition, and to say this is what the agreement is. How's that going to work? I mean, with that everybody says that would be an improvement.
On that note, I have to say that I was actually quite impressed that finally we finally made movement and progress in getting that promulgation being institutionalized through legislation. Because one of the things that we have observed is that political parties, where there is a hung council, they struggle to coalesce, they struggle to come together and to draw coalition agreements. Some of their coalition partnerships, they are formed very loosely without any agreements. For example, just like Ikuruleni, where you have the EFF predominantly there as a partner, but there is no concrete agreement that they agree to when they form these partnerships. So it becomes more binding in that sense that at least there's also promulgation that these agreements will have to be made public, because one of the reasons that this notion has come into effect is that the public has been lamenting on the fact that these agreements are formed behind closed doors. We don't know what constitutes these agreements. We don't know how these agreements link, to the manifestos of these political parties, where we can actually see where political parties converge in terms of their policy ideas, not necessarily ideologically, but policy ideas that are developmentally driven. What are their priorities that binds them together, so that we'll be able to track and monitor these agreements? Right now, if we're operating under clandestine agreements that have only been negotiated and agreed behind back doors, we don't have insight, and therefore it makes it difficult for the public to hold these political parties accountable who are under a coalition. So on that note, how that will be done, it will be a different mechanism that we really want to see how it will unfold, taking into account that they even find it difficult to coalesce within the 14-day given period that they are supposed to coalesce. But on that note, there's much progress that can be seen, particularly from an accountability perspective.
I wonder, Dr. Nzo, I hate to be this person, I wonder if it's possible. Have you met our politicians? I would think that they would probably find ways around that. I mean, I don't know how you would be able to say to people, before you have your mayoral election, because you couldn't do it afterwards, you'd have to make them do it before. So the mechanics matter. You're going to say to them, you have to give us a document. Now, who manages that? And just imagine the complexity. If, for example, just for fun, say the DA were to form a working agreement with the EFF, presumably it would be the COGTA MEC in, say, Gauteng, which might be controlled by the ANC. Now, the COGTA MEC might say, I want to see your document, or I don't accept your document, or I think you're lying to me. I mean, I can just see, I'm afraid to say, I can see a lot of new law in what is a public binding agreement.
Absolutely. I mean, if I can take you back, Stephen, there was once a suggestion that councillors should actually sign performance agreements, if you remember, at the beginning of 2016, after the local government elections. And yet we found that even before we went into the 2021 local government elections, as the public, we never saw those performance agreements and what constitutes those performance agreements, and whether those performance agreements actually bared, resonance with determining if whether these councillors can actually return to office or not, and who was managing these performance agreements, because we saw the provincial COGTA offices of the Premier. They also participated in these agreements. So it will be very interesting in that sense. And also remember that they have other, institutional structures that have been developed, which are called coalition coordinating committees, which are obviously not legislated, but they are supposed to be there for the management and the smooth running of coalitions, and also finding ways in which they can reach cohesive decision making. But as the public, we've never been privy to those coordinating committees in terms of what decisions are being made. And I even doubt that, for example, the MEC of Cooperative Governance has an insight, into those agreements, unless, for example, that MEC is coming from a political party that is part of a coalition formation. So the mechanics, we are yet to see how exactly this is going to pan out, and how enforceable is it going to be, given the fact that it's now going to be legislated according to this proposed bill.
Dr. Nzo, our politics is full of irony sometimes, and it seems to me, maybe you can confirm this for me, we have an ANC minister who presumably has gazetted this bill. It is the ANC that is currently in I'll use the phrase, an informal working arrangement with the EFF in Ekurhuleni and Joburg. So if I've understood things correctly, an ANC minister is proposing a bill that would make a current agreement in which the ANC is involved illegal.
Well, those dynamics are yet to be seen, Stephen, because, I mean, I can even give you another example where politics do come into play, especially, provincial, local government politics and the way in which political parties are intertwined, and sometimes even tensions can arise out of these where political management control comes from. So, for example, in Tshwane, there was a whole lot of allegations that Tshwane was promulgated to be under administration by the MEC, the then MEC of Copter in the Gauteng province, of which Tshwane took that promulgation to court to make it unlawful and illegal, and therefore the DA won that case. So you can see that sometimes these politics do play themselves, especially when there is a stranglehold for power in this instance. So yes, to a large extent, to what extent would some of these decisions have an implication on smaller parties that are not part, of a coalition arrangement that involves an MEC who comes from the majority party that is governing in a province, and yet has to oversee the inner workings of coalition politics at local government level. And also what also comes into mind, Stephen, when you look at the way in which this has been constructed, especially when you're talking about coalition agreements, is that for what we call the mainstream opposition parties, which have declared themselves to be anti-ANC, they had already started to establish election agreements through these so-called moonshot pacts. And the extent to which now this legislation is going to have an impact on some of those agreements and the other agreements that will be done post the elections, because elections are unpredictable as much as we have all these indicators coming from the surveys that are being done. It might have an implication when things don't really go according to what has been expected. So on that end, yes, we have to take note that politics do come into play. Those who hold, dominant positions at a higher policy and legislative perspective might have a better advantage over these processes.
Dr. Thina Newzroom, thank you very much indeed. A lot more to come in this movie, I suspect. Local governance expert and research associate at the University of Johannesburg.